Morgan Ortagus is a former State Department spokesperson. She joins us now from Nashville. Good to see you again, Morgan. So China really trying to take the driver's seat here. And these talks about getting back into the JCPOA, saying drop sanctions on Iran. And, oh, by the way, China just signed an economic cooperation deal with Iran.
Yeah, it's interesting. China is, of course, a signatory to the JCPOA, but, John, they have not been abiding by U.S. sanctions on Iran since the beginning of the Biden administration. And importantly, the Biden administration has not been enforcing these sanctions. So we've seen, this is pretty well known now at this point, that China is buying illicit oil, black market oil from the Iranians. The Biden administration knows this going on. They are not enforcing U.S. sanctions against China. And so I think this is something certainly that the Congress needs to look at. We need to have oversight of this issue. So it's interesting that they're asking for the sanctions to drop, considering they're not abiding by them. And of course, secondarily, moving on to this strategic long-term deal that the Chinese and the Iranians have signed. Listen, there's a very clear senior and junior partner in this deal, and there's been a lot of actually backlash from the people of Iran. They're not happy necessarily about this arrangement. I will say it's something to watch because it's really one of the bigger forays that China is making to the Middle East, which has been dominated, of course, by U.S. and Russian influence, especially over the last decade. And this is the first time the Chinese, of course, do business in the Middle East. They're really making a big power play politically that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, and they've got a way of getting what they want, too. The growing concern with China is that it may make a move to take back Taiwan. Now, for decades, the U.S. policy has been strategic ambiguity, kind of like, well, if you do that, we'll do something. We're just not going to tell you what it is. But that was a policy that was put in place when China was weak. Now that China is this emerging economic and military powerhouse, does that policy need to be toughened up?
Yes, and the New York Times spoke about this morning, and you're actually seeing a bipartisan consensus of people calling for us to relook and really clarify that strategy. You're seeing Richard Haas was talking about it this morning, Bridge Colby, my former colleague at the Pentagon, and the strategic ambiguity, I think, worked for a long time. But when we saw the complete disintegration of democracy in Hong Kong, and this has happened for the 2 years that I was at the State Department with Mike Pompeo, when we saw that, we knew that we were really going to have to look at Taiwan. In the previous administration, we sent high-ranking officials. We sent the HHS Secretary, Alex Azar. We sent Keith Krach, who worked for us at the State Department, to Taiwan. And so we started to send strong signals. But clearly, the Chinese have shown that they're willing to break their commitments to the world as it relates to democracy and autonomy. One has to look no further than Hong Kong. And I got to tell you, the Taiwanese are tough. I visited them a few years ago before I joined government with the Atlantic Council, and their leaders have had pretty nationalistic rhetoric that they're going to fight for their autonomy and their democracy. So the big question is, will America?
Yeah, well, likely that the Chinese wouldn't do anything, at least before the Beijing Olympics, but I guess all bets are off after that. Hey, the budget request came out, $715 billion for the Pentagon, $753 billion in overall national security spending. For the Pentagon, it's just a 1.6% increase. Do you think in the face of this emerging Chinese threat that it should be higher?
Well, one of the things I would say is that I've tried to be as supportive of this administration as possible on their plans for as it relates to the Chinese Communist Party, because I think that this fight against the communists is much bigger than one party. Saying that, it's important for your viewers to know, John, that Biden's budget is effectively it's functionally a cut of the defense budget. The number is bigger, but it does not keep increase with inflation. It also goes against the national defense strategy, which calls somewhere between a 3 and 6% increase. And of course, if you look at the rest of Biden's budget, about 20, he's called for about a 20% increase in non-discretionary spending. So unfortunately, this budget talks about China from a rhetoric perspective, but there's no there when you actually look at the defense budget.
Not surprisingly, Bernie Sanders thinks it's way too much money. Morgan Ortagus, always good to see you.
Thank you, sir.
Sandra?
All right, well,